I thought it was a dead body at first. That's what tumbled out of my mouth when Officer Darius asked me to describe what the dog had led me to. My voice wavered on the word body, and I hated how my hands still trembled. Not from fear, not exactly. It was more like the shiver you get when something extraordinary shakes you awake from a life that's been moving on autopilot for far too long. See, I'm just a regular guy, Graves Harmon, 38, divorced, living alone in a little house on the edge of town. Nothing remarkable. I work maintenance at the county hospital, jog every morning and take my coffee black with 2 sugars. That morning had started like any other, frost painting the grass in delicate silver, my breath puffing out in little clouds as I ran the familiar trail behind my neighborhood. Nothing unusual until I saw her. She was matted, muddy, clearly. Tail stray, some kind of shepherd mix with big amber eyes that held a quiet intelligence. She didn't run, didn't bark, just stood there, watching me with a stillness that felt deliberate. I slowed down because you don't ignore a dog in the woods who looks like she's been waiting for you. There was a wildness to her, but not the dangerous kind, more like a quiet urgency, as if she had something important to show me. She sniffed the ground, lifted her gaze to mine, then turned and trotted a few steps into the trees. "Hey," I called, breathless. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder, waiting. When I took a step forward, she moved again, leading me deeper. I know how it sounds. I wouldn't have believed it either if I hadn't lived it. Leaving the trail, I followed her into the forest. At first, it was just the soft crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. But as we moved deeper, past the old Miller fence, past the rusted-out hunting stand nobody had used in years, the air grew heavier with anticipation. She stopped near a grove of birch trees and began pawing at the ground, frantic, determined. I approached, unsure what I was about to find. It didn't take long, my foot hit something solid, not metal, not rock. Wood. That's when the words slipped out. Dead body. I didn't know what else to think. There, half buried in the earth, was a wooden box. Shallow, like someone had been in a hurry to hide it. My hands shook as I brushed away the dirt. The dog sat a few feet away, ears perked, tail still, watching me with an intensity that made my pulse skip. When I lifted the lid, I didn't find a body, thank God. But what I did find left me just as stunned. Bundles upon bundles, wrapped tight. In plastic, crisp bills, old but preserved as if time had forgotten them. Dozens of stacks, hundreds, maybe more. My mind raced. Drug money? Stolen cash? But before I could process it, I reached for my phone. The police arrived fast, Officer Darius, Sergeant Silas, a couple of deputies, swarming the area like they'd just cracked open a decades-old secret. And maybe they had. They questioned. Me bagged the box, scanned for prints. But through it all, the dog never left my side. Darius crouched beside her. "She led you here?" I nodded. Wouldn't leave me alone. Like she needed me to find it. They checked her. No chip, no collar, no tags. Just a nameless, scruffy stray who'd somehow uncovered a fortune in dirty money. I named her Sable. Don't ask why, it just fit. Maybe it was the warm gold of her fur beneath the dirt. Or maybe it was the way the autumn leaves, red and gold, danced around us that morning, making her seem like she'd stepped right out of the season itself. She slept on my porch that night. The next morning she was still there, tail wagging. After that, I couldn't say no, but let's not jump ahead. The money in the woods was just the beginning. Turns out it was linked to a cold case, a robbery from '92, when 2 masked men hit a credit union upstate and vanished with nearly $2 million. One got caught, the other disappeared, along with most of the cash. The one they caught died in prison years later. No leads until Sable. The story spread, first local, then national. Mystery dog leads jogger to stolen cash. People loved it. Hopeful, mysterious, a little bit magical, and for a while, it was fun. Sable even got her own little fan club. Letters from kids, offers from shelters, a retired K9 handler who wanted to train her, but she stayed with me. Every morning, she waited by the door. Every night, she curled up by the fireplace, her soft breath sinking with the crackle of the flames. I started jogging with her, though really it was more walking now. I talked to her like she understood every word. Sometimes I swear she did. About a week after the money, we were on our usual trail when Sable suddenly darted into the woods again. Same urgency, but no fear this time. She stopped at a rotting log and started digging. My stomach twisted. This time it wasn't money, it was a boot, attached to a foot. I froze. Sable didn't. She barked, sharp, insistent, then sat beside the log, eyes locked on me. I called 911, the fee. Cops came. This time it was a body. Old remains, male, judging by the clothing. They took samples, dusted for evidence, rolled out the crime scene tape. A coroner's van arrived. I gave my statement again. Sable sitting quietly beside me the whole time. When the others left, Darius stayed behind. Darius crouched beside Sable, his fingers gently scratching behind her ear. "She's trying to tell you something," he said softly. "She already did," I replied. He looked up at me, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" My gaze drifted to the disturbed earth where they'd pulled out the remains. That maybe this town's been hiding more than just old money. From that day on, Sable and I became inseparable. Not by choice, really. It was as if she had a purpose, a mission written in the way she carried herself, and somehow against all odds I had become part of it. A few days later, it happened again. This time it was just a tattered jacket buried beneath a tangle of brush behind an abandoned shade near the river. But inside that jacket was a badge, County Sheriff's Office, issued 1987. The name etched into it made Sergeant Silas pause. "Roger Hale," he murmured, his voice heavy with recognition. "He went missing 30 years ago. The jacket was tagged, sent, to the lab. The next morning, Silas called me in. 'You've got one extraordinary dog, Graves. She's not mine,' I said, smiling faintly. 'I think I'm hers.' We laughed, but there was something solemn in his expression, as if he understood this was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Sable led me to 5 more discoveries. An old shotgun beneath a collapsed barn, a duffel bag of jewelry behind a shuttered motel, a rusted license plate that matched a missing persons case from '89. Each time the past cracked open a little wider, reopening old wounds for this town. But with each find came something else too. Answers for families who had spent decades wondering, waiting. And every single time it was Sable who uncovered them. I don't pretend to know how she did it, whether it was instinct, memory, or some inexplicable sense beyond human understanding. All I knew was that she trusted me enough to lead, and I trusted her enough to follow. Eventually, the FBI got involved. Cold cases began connecting like scattered puzzle pieces, finally clicking into place. Names resurfaced. Some I recognized, others long forgotten, buried as deep as the secrets we'd unearthed. But through it all, Sable never changed. She was still the same scruffy, mud-streaked dog with soulful eyes who had found me on that trail and decided, for reasons I'd never known, to stay. One evening, as snowflakes dusted the windows like powdered sugar, Sable rested her head on my knee. I looked down at her, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you really trying to tell me?" She blinked once, slow, deliberate, then closed her eyes and exhaled, as if she'd been holding the weight of the world in that sigh. And that's when I noticed it. A thin, pale scar circling her neck, hidden beneath her thick fur, like the ghost of a rope or a collar pulled too tight. I'd never seen it before. The next morning, we returned to the woods. But this time, Sable led me somewhere new, somewhere I never wanted to go. My father's old hunting cabin. I hadn't stepped foot there in 20 years. It existed in my memory like a half-remembered dream, always lingering, but never quite clear enough to grasp. Dad used to bring me here when I was little. Hunting trips, fishing weekends, or just days when Mom needed us out of the house. After he passed, I never came back. It wasn't grief that kept me away. It was the silence, the unspoken things. That hung heavy over this place, the questions my family had never answered. Sable stood motionless at the base of the porch, her nose twitching but making no sound. She was waiting, patient, as if she knew exactly what lay beneath the surface. The door was locked, of course, but I remembered. Dad had always hidden the spare key under the 3rd floorboard on the steps, and there it was, still tucked away, after all these years, rusted but whole. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the stillness. For a second I braced myself for the scent of decay, of time long past, but there was nothing, just dust and memories, and the faintest hint of pine. The inside was frozen in time, the same wooden table, the old plaid couch, the oil lanterns left exactly where they'd always been. It was as if someone had pressed pause on a life and never pressed play again. I wasn't sure what Sable wanted me to see. She padded past me, sniffing the walls, the couch, then settling near the fireplace. Her tail thumped once, twice. Then she started pawing right beside the brick hearth beneath a faded rug. My pulse quickened as I rolled the rug aside. The floorboards looked ordinary, but when I pressed down, one gave slightly. A hidden compartment. Using the edge of my boot, I pried it open. Inside was a metal box, the kind meant for important things. Heavy. I lifted it out, brushing away decades of grime, and Sable sat back, watching me with quiet intensity. The hinges groaned as I opened. Inside were photos, letters, and something wrapped in brown cloth. My fingers shook as I peeled back the fabric, and there it was, a badge, just like the one we'd found buried near the river, and engraved on it was my father's name, Deputy Thomas Harmon. But that didn't make sense. He was never a deputy. He worked construction. Everyone knew that. He wore flannel and heavy boots, and he always smelled like sawdust and fresh-cut lumber. I picked up one of the letters, his handwriting unmistakable, slightly slanted, careful, like he'd taken his time with every word. It was addressed to someone named Alan. I read the first few lines aloud, my voice unsteady. "Alan, if you're reading this, it means things didn't go the way we planned. I'm sorry. I tried to keep it quiet, but they found out. The girl was never supposed to be there. I didn't know." The words caught in my throat as my stomach twisted into knots. The rest of the box was filled with fragments of a story I couldn't piece together. A gas station receipt from 3 counties away, a map dotted with red circles, a photo of 2 men standing stiffly in front of a white van, and at the very bottom, a small revolver, its chamber missing a single bullet. Sable hadn't moved. She simply watched me, her amber eyes steady, as if she already understood what these clues meant. I sat back, running a hand through my hair. "What are you trying to show me?" The next week passed in a blur. I turned everything over to Officer Darius, the box, the badge, the letters. He didn't say much, just logged each item with careful hands and promised they'd look into it. I think he believed me. I just don't think he was ready for where it might lead. Sable stayed close, sleeping curled at the foot of my bed now, her wiry frame finally relaxed. But every morning, without fail, she was up before dawn, tail wagging, ready to lead me down paths I'd never taken before. I'd started wearing a chest harness with my phone recording, just in case. You never knew what we might need to remember. The Vi. Next day she took me to a crumbling shack near the quarry. Inside we found old dynamite crates and a scrap of red flannel tied around a rafter. When the crime scene team arrived, they uncovered more. Burn marks scorched into the beams, a blackened patch of floor hidden beneath layers of dust. Someone had tried to erase something here long ago. Then came the farmhouse. This time Sable was insistent, barking without pause until I followed her up the slope to a weather-worn house, its roof half collapsed. I hesitated, but she darted through. A gap in the wall, leaving me no choice but to follow. We picked our way through broken beams and cracked tiles until she stopped beside an overturned cabinet. Inside was a journal. The name on the cover sent a chill through me, one of the suspects from the 1992 robbery. But this wasn't just a notebook. It was a confession. Plans, names, payments, every detail laid bare. And according to those pages, my father wasn't just a construction worker. He was a deputy, part of the crew. Everything I thought I knew about him unraveled in that moment. Darius took the journal straight to the FBI. Sable and I stood by as they boxed up the evidence, my chest hollow, as if someone had carved out a piece of my past, and left only shadows behind. But Sable wouldn't let me linger in that feeling. The next morning she was at the door again, her nose pressed to the glass, tail thumping impatiently. She led me to the old mill pond, where the water lapped gently at the muddy shore. There, half buried near the edge, was a necklace, gold with a tiny dove charm. When I turned it over, initials glinted in the sunlight. MHI didn't recognize the name, but the police did. Melanie Ellen Hayes, reported missing in 1993, never found. She was 17. Sable had just uncovered the last thing she'd ever worn that night, Silas called. "The cold case team is opening 3 new files because of what you and Sable found," he said, voice gruff. "Graves. She might be the most important non-human witness in this county's history." I sat on the porch, Sable at my feet, her warm weight pressed against my leg. The stars stretched endlessly above us. "You don't realize what you've started," Silas added. I didn't answer. I was too busy thinking about Dad, about the secrets he'd buried, the questions families had carried for decades, the truth he might have shared if he'd had more time. Sable shifted beside me, letting out a soft, tired sigh. "You knew him, didn't you?" I whispered. Somehow you knew. She didn't answer. But the next day she led me to an old elementary school, its halls silent since a flood 20 years ago. In the gymnasium she pawed at a locker until it creaked open. Inside was a bundle of letters, some still legible despite the water damage. They were written by Charles Milton, one of the robbers, from prison, pages filled with regret, with fear, and with a single staggering admission: Tom H. backed out at the last minute. My father. The letter said he couldn't go through with it. That, he'd bury what he knew, disappear, leave it all behind. That's when it hit me. He hadn't hidden the money. He'd hidden the truth. Maybe he'd kept the badge to remind himself of who he was or who he wasn't. Maybe he'd hoped someday someone would find it. Sable. And I sat on the gym steps as the sun dipped below, the horizon painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. I thought about calling my mother. We hadn't spoken in years. Maybe she knew more than she'd ever said. Maybe not. But if Sable kept leading me deeper into the past, I had to be ready to face whatever answers waited. That night a sound woke me. Not a bark, but a quiet whine. Sable stood at the edge of the yard, her gaze fixed on the woods. Another clue? I asked, pulling on my coat, still half asleep. But she didn't move, just looked at me, then back at the trees as if asking me to trust her one more time. The air was colder than usual, the trees looming taller, darker, though I'd walked these woods 100 times before. Sable led me forward, her steps slow, deliberate. This wasn't like the other times. She stopped at a flat stone, moss-covered, more marker than grave. Beneath it was a hollow, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were two things: a photograph and a cassette tape. The photo showed 4 men, one was my father. The others I didn't recognize. The tape had a date scribbled in faded ink, March 17th, 1992. I didn't own a cassette player anymore, but I knew exactly who did. And when I finally heard what was on that tape, everything clicked into place. Though, that's a story for later, because Sable still had more to show me. It had been over 20 years since I'd last heard the soft hiss and mechanical clunk of a cassette tape. But when Glenn Cooper slid that old tape into his vintage player at the repair shop, the familiar sound washed over me, like a warm wave of nostalgia. Glenn was one of the last people in town who still worked on outdated electronics. And true to form, he didn't ask questions when I showed up with the tape, my face tight with unspoken tension. He just nodded, set the player on his workbench, and pressed play. Sable sat by the door, ears perked but calm, as if she already knew what we were about to hear. The voice on the tape wasn't my father's. It was grittier, older, with a slow southern drawl that made every word feel weighted. I leaned in, listening closely. March 17th, we got the final layout. Banks got no secondary alarm and the weekend crew's down to 3 people. Tom's nervous, says he wants out. I told him we can't have nerves now, not after all the planning, not after what we buried. Glenn raised an eyebrow but stayed silent as the tape kept rolling. Then another voice cut in, quieter, unsteady. My father. I didn't sign up for this. I thought we were just scaring them. That girl was barely out of high school. I didn't know she'd be there. A long silence stretched before the first voice returned, colder now. You back out now, Tom, and you're dead. You and your kid, you hear me? We all got skin in this. My throat went dry. Glenn switched off the tape. You okay, Graves? I nodded slowly. That was my dad. And the other guy. I shook my head. Sounds like they were planning more than a robbery. Sounds like someone died. Sable stood, her tail giving a little twitch. She knows, I murmured. Somehow she always knows. I thanked Glenn, tucked the tape into my pocket, and stepped outside with Sable trotting faithfully beside me. The morning light was thin, struggling through rain-heavy clouds, matching the weight in my chest. I needed to talk to my mum. She'd always avoided questions about Dad's past, especially after his death. Maybe she'd been trying to protect me, or maybe she didn't know any more than I did. Either way, the time for silence was over. Her duplex was one of those cozy senior units with plastic flowers lining the porch and wind chimes that sang softly when I knocked. The door opened and her face lit up with surprise, but not unhappiness. Graves, she said, her voice warm. It's been a while. I didn't waste time. I found some things, Mom. About Dad. About what he used to do. Her expression shifted. Not shock, not fear, just a slow, weary acceptance. I always knew this day would come, she said, sinking onto her floral-patterned couch. I stayed standing. Why didn't you ever tell me he was a deputy? Because he wasn't supposed to be one, she admitted. Not officially. He worked part-time under the table, helping a friend on the force. He wanted extra money before you were born, said it was temporary. Then, he got pulled in deeper. She hesitated. They used him, had him deliver things, intimidate people. At first, it was favors. Then it turned into threats. He wanted out, but by then, it was too late. Who were they, Mom? She rubbed her temples. Some wore uniforms, some didn't. They were connected. Judges, business owners, people who kept each other out of trouble. He didn't want any part of it. but he thought if he stayed in, he could protect you. Sable settled at my feet, resting her chin on her paws. Did you know about the girl? I asked softly. Mom nodded once. I didn't know it was going to happen. But afterward, he came home and cried like I'd never seen before. Said he saw her face every time he closed his eyes. He said he couldn't fix it, but he'd try to keep anyone else from getting hurt. I felt hollow, like the ground had shifted beneath me. I found a tape, I said. They threatened him, said they'd hurt me if he backed out. Her eyes glistened as she looked away. That's why he disappeared so much those last few years. He was trying to stay off their radar. I left soon after, needing air, needing space. And Sable, as always, knew exactly where to take me. She led me down a narrow trail near Hollow Creek, one I hadn't walked since I was a teenager. We crossed the old wooden bridge, past a row of slender birch trees, and stepped into a sunlit clearing where a rusted bench sat forgotten. There, beneath a pile of sticks, was another metal box. Inside were dozens of photos, some black and white, others faded to sepia. All of them showed the same group of men, some in suits, some in sheriff's uniforms. My father was in several, so was Judge Robert Dellinger, his face familiar from the courthouse painting. Sable sniffed at one of the photos, then turned and started pawing at the base of a nearby tree. I knelt beside her, digging until my fingers hit something solid, a lockbox with RD scratched into the lid. Inside were a ring of keys, a sealed envelope, and a stained manila folder, labeled For Tom. The folder held a handwritten will, not my father's, Judge Dinger's. I'm writing this because if Tom ever finds this, it means I didn't make it, it began. He deserves the truth. We started something and it got away from us. We told ourselves it was about justice, about money, about righting wrongs, but the cost was far greater than we'd ever imagined. It stole lives, it hollowed out our souls. And there, in cold black ink, were the names, the dates, the addresses, including one that turned my blood to ice. Alan Marston, my father's closest friend, my godfather. He lived just 2 towns over, though I hadn't seen him in years. But Sable hadn't forgotten. The next morning she stood at the door again, tail low, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting. We drove out early. Alan's house sat on a quiet street near an old fishing dock, the air thick with the scent of salt and damp wood. Age had slowed him, but his mind was sharp as ever. When I showed him the photo, his breath caught. "Where'd you get that?" he asked, voice rough. "Sable found it," I said, "just like she finds everything else." He studied her with a strange, quiet recognition. "That dog's not normal," he murmured. "Your dad had one just like her, same eyes, same way of watching, like she sees right through you. You think it's the same dog?" "No, that one died in '94, but something about her." He shook his head. "Maybe. Some things come back when they're needed." I handed him the will. He read it in silence, fingers trembling slightly. "I tried to stop it," he admitted at last. "We all did, in our own ways. But none of us had the guts to go to the police. We thought if we buried the evidence, it'd stay buried." He let out a bitter chuckle. It didn't. His gaze softened as Sable settled beside him, leaning into his touch. As he scratched behind her ears, for a long moment, the only sound was the distant cry of gulls over the water. Before I left, Alan pressed a slip of paper into my hand. Not just a name, but an address, a phone number, and a warning. "Be careful," he said, voice low. "Not all of them are dead, and the ones still breathing, they'll do anything to stay out of prison." Sable and I drove back in silence. The sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, the kind that lingers before it finally breaks. I kept my foot, light on the gas, turning Alan's words over in my mind. When we got home, a man was parked in front of my house. He stepped out of his car with slow, deliberate movements. Mid-60s, salt and pepper beard, dark coat draped over broad shoulders. "Victor Emery," he introduced himself. "A retired cop." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you've been digging into the past." "Not by choice," I said. "You might want to stop." "For your sake," Sable growled, low and warning. He glanced at her and laughed, soft but humorless. "Still got some fight in her, huh?" He shook his head. "Figures you'd pick a dog like that." "I didn't pick her," I said. "She picked me." He turned to leave, pausing just long enough to toss over his shoulder. "Well, if she picks your next destination, maybe tell her to choose one that doesn't get you killed." I watched his taillights disappear, my pulse hammering. In my throat. That night, I spread the photos out again, and there, tucked between 2 faded snapshots, was one I hadn't noticed before. My father and Victor Emery, shaking hands outside a bank, faces unreadable. Sable rested her chin on my foot, her dark eyes wide and alert. She was waiting for tomorrow for the next clue, for whatever piece of the past we were meant to uncover next, and something told me the next one would be the hardest yet. The next morning, Sable refused to leave the yard. That alone told me everything. She stood rigid, front paws pressed to the fence, gaze locked on the trees behind the house. Normally she'd pace, bark, nudge me toward whatever trail she wanted us to follow. But today, she was still, watching. I sipped my coffee, trying to pretend things were normal, even though nothing had been normal since the day she trotted into my life. But the weight in my chest, the gnawing tension from Victor Emery's warning the night before made it hard to swallow. He hadn't threatened me. Not outright. That was the worst kind of threat, the kind where you knew the person had done it before and didn't need to say they'd do it again. I stared at Sable. She stared back. Then, slowly, she turned her head to the right. That's when I saw it. A thin trail of smoke, barely visible, curling up through the trees. I grabbed my coat, my phone, a flashlight. Sable took off ahead of me, paws silent on the dewy grass. We moved fast, cutting through the forest's edge, following the smoke's source. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something faintly sour. As we got closer, I saw the remnants of a campfire, recently doused. Someone had been here. A green tarp lay folded beside a tree, and beneath it a half-zipped duffel bag. Sable sniffed it, then backed away, ears flat. I unzipped it carefully. Inside, binoculars, an empty coffee thermos, a camera with a long lens, and a notepad. I flipped it open. My name was on the first page, followed by my address, my job, where I shopped, what time I walked Sable. Every page was filled with details about my life, my movements, my routines. Someone had been watching me. Sat back on my heels, suddenly cold. Sable moved to the other side of the clearing and started digging near a pile of brush. She barked, once sharp and insistent. I ran over and helped. Beneath the damp leaves and dirt, we found a rusted lunchbox. Inside, cassette tapes. I took it all back home and spent the next hour in Glenn's garage listening. Each tape held recordings, phone, calls, meetings, snippets of conversation. Some were muffled, just street noise. Others were crystal clear. One tape seized my attention immediately. He's getting close. If Harmon keeps sniffing, someone's going to connect the tapes to what happened at Dinger's place. A pause. Then, calm, confident, the same voice from the original tape I'd found, the one who'd threatened my father. Don't worry. He'll back off. They all do. Sable pressed her head against my knee as I listened. I leaned down, scratching behind. Her ears. We're not backing off, I whispered. Sable remained curled at the foot of my bed, a soft, silent guardian, but even she couldn't find peace in sleep. Every now and then she twitched, her ears flicking, her paws paddling gently, as if chasing phantoms in her dreams. Around 4 in the morning she rose, stretched with a quiet grace, and padded to the door. Without a word, I dressed and followed. Her? The streets lay hushed and empty, just how I loved them, the air cool and damp, carrying the faint, comforting scent of pine. Sable guided me toward the east side of town, where the looming industrial buildings slowly surrendered to forgotten neighborhoods. We passed the old paint factory, its walls weathered by time, then the rusted skeletons of school buses resting in an overgrown lot, before finally arriving at a tired fence crowned with faded no trespassing signs. This was the city's storage yard. An old depot cluttered with broken-down vehicles, discarded equipment, and secrets buried deep. Sable slipped through a gap in the fence and I followed, careful not to let the chain link snag my jacket. She led me to a rusted shed in the far corner, its padlock missing, the door propped open by a cinder block. Inside, the darkness clung, thick, the air heavy with the mingled scents of oil, mildew, and something sharper, metallic, almost electric. Sable sniffed along the back of the shed, then began pawing at a pile of tarps. I moved them aside and found a wooden crate, sturdy and handcrafted, its top nailed shut. A crowbar hung on the wall, and after a few firm prees the crate gave way. Inside lay stacks of documents, typed reports, old VHS tapes, ledgers, even cassette recordings. Some files bore names I knew: Dinger, Emery, Marston. Others were strangers. My hands trembled as I packed everything into my backpack, and we left quickly, my nerves humming like live wires. Back home, I spread the contents across the living room floor. Sable settled beside me, her watchful eyes following as I sifted through the files. What I found wove everything together: transcripts of surveillance from 1991 through 1999, handwritten, notes detailing bribes, payoffs, even the monitoring of officers deemed non-compliant. There was a list of those marked for silence. My father's name was there. So was someone named Deborah Lynn Hayes. The last name struck me. It matched the necklace Sable had found near the pond, the one with the dove charm. That girl, Melanie Hayes, the one who'd gone missing. I found a file labeled MH. Inside was a photo of a teenage girl in a school jacket, her smile bright and unguarded. The case summary was typed, clinical cruel witness, unintended presence, last seen 3/17/92, presumed eliminated. My stomach twisted. That was the day of the robbery. Sable rested her head on my lap, warm and steady, an anchor in the storm. I leaned back, forcing my breath to slow. I had to tell Darius, I had to tell Agent Miller, but first I had to see this through. Sable wasn't finished. By sunrise, she was ready to go again. We drove to the ranger station, the second dot on Eddie Lampert's map. It had burned down years ago, leaving only concrete slabs swallowed by moss and thistles. Sable sniffed along the western wall, circling a tangle of vines before letting out a sharp bark. Once then again, I knelt, brushing the vines aside. Beneath them lay a rusted trapdoor. With all my strength, I pried it open. The hinges screamed in protest, releasing a stale, foul breath of trapped air. Sable waited at the edge as I shone my flashlight into the darkness. A set of stairs led down into a shallow crawl space. I descended slowly, each step groaning under my boots. At the bottom, I found a lockbox wrapped in plastic. Inside were two reels of film and a notebook labeled meeting logs. The logs detailed secret gatherings by a group calling themselves the Quiet Circle. According to the entries, their mission was to keep local justice in the hands of those who understood it best. They bribed, they blackmailed, they buried anything or anyone in their way. One entry stood out, 1692. DH raised concerns about the girl. Says she's just a witness, wants to let her go. TH agreed. RD and EM overruled. Operation proceeds as planned. My fingers traced the initials. Each letter seared itself into my memory. Sable whimpered softly, backing away from the crawl space. We drove straight to Darius. I handed him everything, the crate, the logs, the tapes, the film. He brought in Miller, and within hours, a federal task force was dissecting the evidence. Miller gave me a warning. This isn't going to stay quiet. For long, I don't want it to, I replied. Not anymore. That night, Sable sat by the window for hours staring into the dark. The next morning, she nudged me awake before dawn. No barking, no whining, just a quiet, insistent urgency. We drove to the cemetery. My father's grave stood on a hill near the edge, shaded by a great oak. Sable sat before it, then turned her, gazed toward a stone 4 plots over. One I hadn't noticed before. MH, Melanie Ellen Hayes. Fresh flowers lay at its base. Someone had been visiting. My heart pounded as I knelt. Sable pawed at the grass beside the grave. I dug with my hands until my fingers struck something hard. A sealed plastic container. Inside was a cassette labeled, "To Graves." My hands shook as we raced back to Glenn's garage. When I played it, my father's voice filled the space, weary. "But clear Graves, if you're hearing this, it means the truth has finally found its way out. I wish I could explain everything face to face, but I was a coward. I made choices that haunt me every day. That girl, Melanie, she shouldn't have died. I tried to protect her. I tried to stop them. I failed, but I left the pieces behind. For you, for Sable. If she's with you, then I know you're safe." He paused and I heard a sniffle. "I'm proud of you, son, and I'm sorry. So sorry." The tape ended. I sat in silence. Glenn didn't say a word. Sable curled up beside me, her warmth steady against my leg, and didn't move. Later that day, Darius called. The third and final location from Eddie's map, the old Marlowe Theater, was being investigated. The feds had found what they called a vault. Sealed files, names, payouts, even law enforcement personnel who had accepted hush money. Darius sounded different, tired, but maybe, just maybe, hopeful. "You and that dog," he said. "You shook the whole tree." That evening a letter arrived in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photo of me and Sable, taken from across the street. A note was scribbled on the back in jagged handwriting. "You should have stopped. I locked the doors that night, slept with a flashlight in one hand, and Sable at the foot of my bed. But despite the fear gnawing at my ribs, I knew one thing. We were close. Not to the end, but to something bigger than I'd ever imagined. Sable knew where to go next. She always did. And whatever was still buried out there, we were going to find it." The photo hadn't been taken from far. probably no more than 20 feet across the street. That meant whoever was watching us wasn't just bold, they were close. Close enough to know when I was home, when I was with Sable, when I wasn't looking. I turned the photo over again, tracing the words scrawled in thick black ink. You should have stopped. Sable sat next to me at the kitchen table, her eyes steady on the door. Her presence was the only thing keeping me from spiraling into full-blown panic. There was a calm to her, a quiet steadiness that made me believe, even if just barely, that I wasn't alone in this. I called Darius first, then Miller. They both told me the same thing. Stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone. And if anything else happens, call immediately. I didn't tell them I was planning to do exactly the opposite, because I knew what Sable wanted. She didn't pace, didn't bark. She simply stood, walked to the door, and turned to look at me. We were leaving. Sable led me west this time, past the edge of town. We followed a winding path through woods that had long since stopped pretending to be part of civilization. Fallen trees, brambles, the skeletal remains of old hunting blinds. This was the part of the county people didn't talk about anymore, not because it was haunted, but because it held nothing they wanted to remember. After about 2 hours of walking, we reached a clearing. A dilapidated structure stood at the center, part barn, part cabin, collapsed in on itself like a forgotten secret. Sable sniffed along the outer wall, then barked once, sharp and sure. I walked over, pushed aside a sheet of warped plywood, and saw it. A trap door, half covered in dirt. No lock, just a heavy iron handle. I yanked it open and a gust of musty, cold air rushed up to meet me. The stairs leading down were rotten in places, but they held. Sable didn't hesitate. She padded down like she knew the way. At the bottom, we found a room. Stone walls, dirt floor, 2 metal filing cabinets against the back wall, a broken chair, and a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. I turned it on. The light flickered to life. Sable sniffed at the cabinets. I pulled them open, one drawer at a time. Inside were hundreds of documents, arrest records, court transcripts, lists of cases dismissed, charges dropped, suspects released. And scrawled in red ink across many of the folders were 2 letters, QC, Quiet Circle. This place wasn't just storage. It was a black archive, a place to bury things so deep no one would ever find them. Until now. I took pictures of everything. Sable pawed at a drawer marked 1992. Inside I found a sealed envelope addressed to T. Harmon, my father. I opened it and pulled out a short note. Tom, if you ever come back here, you'll know we failed. I tried to keep her out of it. You were right, but I was too scared to stand up to them. If you want redemption, the rest is at Hayward Point. You'll know what to do. A.M. Alan Marston. I stared at the paper for a long time. Hayward Point was on the coast. An old summer spot from decades ago, mostly cliffs and walking paths. If there was something hidden there, it had stayed buried a long time. I texted Darius a quick update and told him I'd meet him later. I didn't want to risk anyone stopping me before I got there. Sable rode in the passenger seat as we made the drive to Hayward Point. She sat upright the whole time, alert, like she knew this mattered more than anything else we'd found so far. The parking lot at Hayward Point was empty, just as I expected. Most people didn't come out this far unless they were hikers or trying to be alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my camera, and followed Sable along the cliff trail. After a mile, she veered off the path into thick underbrush. I followed her until we reached a rock formation that jutted out over the water. Beneath it was a natural alcove, shielded from view unless you were standing right in front of it. Sable sniffed along the base of the rock and began to dig. I dropped to my knees and helped. Within minutes, our fingers brushed against another wooden box, its weight heavy, with secrets. Inside lay a reel-to-reel tape, a stack of handwritten notes yellowed with time, and something carefully wrapped in cloth. My hands trembled as I unfolded the fabric, revealing a delicate silver bracelet with a dove charm. Its twin had once graced Melanie Hayes's wrist. The initials MH etched inside sent my heart plummeting. The notes were my father's confession, page after page pouring out his guilt. He hadn't just witnessed the robbery and cover-up. He'd documented every meeting, every whispered threat, every moment of cowardice. The tape, labeled Final Recording, demanded to be heard. Without a player, we raced to Glenn's place, where he waited on the porch as if anticipating our arrival. As the reel began spinning, my father's voice filled the garage with heartbreaking clarity. If this is ever played, it means my son found the trail. Graves, I hope you never hear this, but if you do, know this burden was never meant for you. I tried to make things right, but they were stronger, smarter, more ruthless. I buried what evidence I could, but I couldn't save Melanie. Couldn't stop Alan from being silenced. Couldn't protect that girl's mother from disappearing. They called themselves the Quiet Circle because they believed silence was strength. But silence is a cancer. It festers. It destroys. Take what you've found and finish this. Bring it all into the light. And if Sable's still with you, then I know you're not alone. The tape hissed to silence. Glenn remained wordless, his face etched with sorrow. Sable gently rested her chin on my knee, her warm breath steadying my racing heart. By dawn, federal agents swarmed Hayward Point, collecting the box, bracelet, notes and tape as evidence. I thought our journey had ended, until Darius called. That evening, his voice tight with revelation. "We found something else," he said, "behind the ranger station. Another box. Inside were surveillance photos. Your father, Melanie, and you, Graves. Pictures from when you were just a boy." My knees buckled. Sable pressed against my leg as Darius continued. "Your father warned them if anything happened to Melanie, he'd go public. If they touched you, he'd burn everything down. Those photos, they were leverage. You're the reason they kept him alive as long as they did." That night, sleep refused to come. Sable stayed close as I paced, staring at the first photo I'd ever taken of her. The day she led me into the woods. Those knowing eyes hadn't changed. Piece by piece, it all came together. Not random clues, but purposeful breadcrumbs she'd led me to. The two bracelets. One left exposed near the pond, the other carefully preserved at Hayward Point. One a marker, the other a message. Comparing Melanie's photo to Sable, I saw it. The same gentle wisdom in their eyes. Whether by fate or something deeper, Sable wasn't just helping me uncover the truth, she was woven into its very fabric, and our story wasn't finished. I awoke to the soft thump of Sable's tail against hardwood. Pre-dawn darkness still clung to the room, but the air hummed. With anticipation, she sat patiently by the door, eyes fixed ahead with quiet determination. No barking, no restlessness, just certainty. Boots laced and coat zipped, I followed her into the morning mist. She led me along forgotten trails behind the house, beneath arching trees that stood like silent guardians. Past the ridge with its fallen oak beyond the dry creek bed, further than I'd ventured since childhood, until we reached a birch-ringed clearing untouched by dawn's light. At the center, Sable sat, waited. Then with a single, meaningful bark, she began digging. The earth gave way surprisingly easy, as if it had been waiting for us. Within minutes, my fingers brushed against something solid, a narrow, long wooden box, the kind meant to cradle precious tools or perhaps a cherished family heirloom. Gently, I pried it open. Inside lay a weathered photo album, wrapped in plastic and sealed with tape, as if someone had tried to protect its memories from time itself. I peeled it open slowly, my breath hitching as I turned the first fragile page. Photos of Melanie Hayes stared back at me. Not stiff school portraits or yearbook snapshots, but intimate, candid glimpses of her life. Her dog, her room, her friends, all lovingly preserved. Someone had documented her world with tenderness. I flipped further, and then my heart stopped. There we were, Melanie, my father, and me. I couldn't have been more than 6 years old, standing in front of a cozy fishing cabin, Melanie's arm draped around me like an older sister's. My younger self gazed up at her with pure admiration. I didn't remember her, not a single moment. Yet here it was, proof that I had known her, that she had been part of my life. Sable nosed the edge of the album softly, as if sensing its significance, then settled beside it with a quiet sigh. I sat back, dizzy, my mind racing through the fog of forgotten years, straining to grasp even a whisper of memory. But there was nothing, just empty space where her voice should have been. Clutching the album, we headed back. Glenn was already awake when I knocked. He let me in without a word, while Sable curled into her favorite spot by the radiator. I showed him the album, and as he leafed through the pictures, his brow furrowed. "You're sure you don't remember?" "Her? Not at all, but my father had, and so had she." "You think maybe he tried to hide you?" Glenn murmured. "Not just from them, but from the memories too." I nodded slowly. It would explain so much. Why he kept me away from certain places. Why he uprooted us so suddenly. He must have known something terrible had happened, and he couldn't bear for me to remember. Glenn closed the album. "You ready for more?" "No," I admitted, "but that hasn't stopped me yet." That afternoon, Darius called. "We've confirmed several members of the Quiet Circle still live in the area, some in pretty influential positions. Are you going to arrest them?" "We're building the cases. It has to be airtight. But we've already got one in custody, Roger Denton, former county clerk. He folded the second we showed him the ranger station logs. A flicker of satisfaction warmed my chest. One down. Later that night, as Sable dozed on the rug, I sifted through the items I'd stored in my garage. The box from the cemetery, Judge Dinger's letters, the tape of my father's final message. I spread them across the table like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved, and then I saw it, something I'd missed before. Scrawled in the margin of Dinger's journal was an address, 419 Pine Hollow Creek Road. No name, no explanation. Just those numbers, stark and deliberate. I didn't recognize it at first, so I drove by the next morning. The house was small, tucked shyly behind a row of larger homes, as if hiding from the world. The yard was overgrown, the mailbox rusted shut. I knocked. No answer. Sable sniffed the door, then circled the house, stopping at a boarded-up cellar entrance. She barked twice, sharp, certain. With the flat of a shovel from the shed, I pried it open. Inside was a room crammed with boxes, papers, audio tapes, and walls lined with maps. Then, from the shadows, a man stepped forward. "You shouldn't be." "Here," he said. I froze. "Who are you?" "My name's Arthur Maynard. I was Dinger's secretary for almost 10 years. His gaze flicked to Sable, then back to me. "She led you here, didn't she?" I nodded. "She's been leading me everywhere." Arthur stepped back, gesturing to the room. "Everything I saved is in here. I knew one day someone might come. Someone with questions, maybe even someone with her." "You knew her?" I asked. "I knew the original dog," he said softly. "The one that belonged to Melanie. She was trained, smart, smarter than most people I knew. When Melanie went missing, that dog stayed by her mother's side until the woman disappeared too. You think Sable is the same dog?" Arthur's smile was faint, knowing. "I think Sable is whoever she needs to be." I didn't argue. Instead, he handed me a box. "This one has the final list, every name tied to the quiet circle, every vote they rigged, every trial they fixed." We loaded it into the car and drove straight to Miller. She met us at the field office, her eyes widening as we unboxed. "The evidence. This is enough to go federal," she breathed. "Combined with what we already have," Darius added, "and it's thanks to you and her." Sable wagged her tail softly, but her gaze remained fixed on something beyond the room. She wasn't finished. That night, we stayed at Glenn's place, safer there, with others around. I sat by the fire, Sable curled beside me, and paged through the old photo album once more. I lingered on the picture of Melanie holding me, then turned to the next and then the next, until I found one I hadn't noticed before. Melanie in a small concrete room, a red mark on the wall, a handprint. Knew that mark. I'd seen it weeks ago when Sable and I visited the burned-out basement of the old church. I thought it was paint. It wasn't. I stared at the image for a long, silent moment, then stood. "We have to go back." Sable rose with me, steady and sure. We left before sunrise, heading for the ruins of the church. Sable led the way without hesitation, stopping at the same collapsed stairwell. She sniffed once, then stepped back. There, beneath the rubble, I found a steel panel bolted to the floor. With every ounce of strength, I pried it up. Beneath it yawned a narrow shaft, barely wide enough to fit through. But we did, and what we found below wasn't just the truth. It was the voice they'd tried hardest to silence. This time, it wasn't just names on paper. This time, it could talk. The shaft was colder than I'd imagined. My shoulders scraped against the rough walls as I lowered myself down, flashlight clutched in my right hand, while Sable waited above, her paws padding restlessly at the edge. It wasn't deep, maybe 15 feet, but the moment I dropped below the surface, the air changed. It grew heavier, thick with a silence that made my own heartbeat echo in my ears. My boots hit solid ground, and I turned in a slow circle. The space was narrow, carved crudely from dirt and stone, its walls shored up with old timber beams, likely remnants from when the church above still stood. The flashlight beam flickered over something metallic ahead, an old filing cabinet, tipped sideways, its drawers cracked open like broken ribs, spilling yellowed folders across the dirt. But Sable hadn't barked at paperwork. There was another sound now, soft, uneven breathing. I turned, and there, huddled in the corner, was a man curled into himself, as if he'd been down here for a long, long time. His clothes were worn and stained, but layered carefully, the way someone who knew winter well would dress. I took a cautious step forward. "Hey," I said softly. "Are you hurt?" The man flinched but didn't speak. I crouched slowly, angling the flashlight low so I wouldn't blind him. "My name's Graves. I'm not here to hurt you. The dog, she led me here. At that," he stirred. His eyes lifted to mine, pale blue, faintly milky with exhaustion. "She still remembers," he rasped. I froze. "You know her?" He gave a weak chuckle. "She found me once, too, years ago. Thought she was a ghost." Above us, Sable barked, sharp and clear. I glanced up to see her peering down through the shaft, her gaze locked on the man. When I turned back to him, his expression had shifted, something like recognition flickering in his tired eyes. "What's your name?" I asked. He hesitated. Paul Mercer." I knew that name. He'd been in the original payroll files Darius had shown me, a name buried under rows of others who had supposedly vanished after the investigation into the quiet circle began. "You were part of it," I said. Paul looked down. "Not at first. I was. Just a contractor. Helped build the bunker, didn't ask questions." He swallowed hard. "Then I saw what they were storing here, what they were hiding. Why are you down here now? They tried to shut me up. I ran. Been running ever since." His voice cracked. "But when I came back to town to find my sister, someone found me first." I scanned the room. "They put you here, locked me in. Figured I'd die. Would have too if the rain hadn't cracked the shaft lid last week." His fingers trembled against his knees. "Been waiting for someone ever since." I radioed Darius immediately, giving him our location and telling him to bring medical help. Within the hour, agents were hauling Paul out of the shaft on a stretcher. Sable paced beside him, her tail brushing his side as if reassuring him. "Stay awake, stay with us." At the hospital, Darius and Miller questioned him for hours. Paul didn't hold back. He gave them names, locations, passwords to off-site servers, identities of people who thought they'd erased their past. But what struck me most was when he looked at me, his voice quiet but certain. She always knew who was worth saving. That evening, after I got home, I sat with Sable on the porch. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees in slow swaying arcs against the dimming sky. I reached down and ran my hand along her back. "You were watching over him, weren't you?" She didn't move, but I knew. The next morning, Darius showed up. At my door, "We raided a farmhouse last night," one Paul pointed out. He hesitated. "It was being used as a safe house by the last active members of the Quiet Circle. We found weapons, records, maps of the town." Another pause. "One of the maps had your house circled in red." I didn't answer. I just looked down at Sable, who was now sitting between me and the door, her ears pricked forward. "You think they're still coming?" I asked. "I think some of them might be desperate enough to try. Then let's not give them the chance." We started preparing that day. The feds helped set up surveillance. Neighbors were quietly warned, and I was given a secure line to the station. But through all of it, Sable stayed focused. She wasn't just alert, she was leading again. This time, to the outskirts of Raven Hollow, a stretch of land I hadn't thought about in years. It used to be an old hunting preserve before the land was bought up and fenced off. No one had touched it since the 90s. Sable led me past the boundary, through a narrow deer trail that wound around a ravine. We came to a clearing where a rusted-out truck sat half sunk in the mud, wrapped in ivy, its tires gone, windows smashed. Sable sniffed at the passenger side door, then barked once. I pulled it open. Inside was a body, long decomposed but still identifiable from the badge lying in the skeleton's lap. Sheriff Vernon Royce. He'd disappeared in 1994, officially presumed. Dead after a boating accident. Except this was no lake, and there was no boat. I called Darius. They sent a forensic team. Sable sat beside the truck, watching silently as they loaded the remains into a bag. Then one of the techs pulled a weatherproof envelope from under the IFE seat. Got something he called it was a letter, addressed to whomever finds this. I read it aloud. I made my choice. They were going to kill me. I ran. I thought hiding would keep my family safe, but even now I know it wasn't enough. If you're reading this, dig up the cabin at Stag's Point. You'll find the final ledger there. I buried it under the ash tree. Sable stood, her tail giving one decisive wag. She was ready. Stag's Point was a rugged cliffside retreat about an hour's drive away, the kind of place where families once gathered for summer camping trips under starry skies. We drove straight there, a shovel rattling in the trunk and my pulse, keeping time with the tires on pavement. The cabin still stood, barely, its weathered timbers clinging to memories of better days. Sable led me around back without hesitation, making straight for the tallest ash tree on the property, its golden, autumn leaves whispering in the breeze. She began digging with quiet determination, her paws moving earth with practiced ease. It didn't take long. The box we uncovered was heavier than the others, made of steel with a stubborn padlock. Glenn's bolt cutters made quick work of it. Inside lay a red ledger, its pages filled with meticulous records of transactions, bribes, withdrawals. But these weren't just names. Each entry told a story marked with cryptic codes that hinted at dark secrets. Then I found the page that stopped my breath. In the corner, signed in familiar handwriting, Thomas Harmon, my father. Beneath it, a note that made my throat tighten. If you find this, it means I couldn't protect you from it all, but maybe now you can protect someone else. The world seemed to hold its breath with me. Sable pressed her warm head against my side, steadying me as I traced my father's words with trembling fingers. We brought the ledger to Darius and Miller. They stared at it on the desk like it might disappear. "You've given us everything we need," Miller said quietly. "I'm not done," I replied. Sable lifted her head at that because she knew there was still one more thread to pull, one more truth waiting to be found, and she would lead me there. The next morning came too soon. At 6 a.m., Sable nudged me awake, her cold nose insistent against my hand. The house stood silent, except for the refrigerator's hum and the grandfather clock's patient ticking in the hallway. Sleep had been scarce lately. Between the ledgers, the letters, and the ghostly voices from old tapes that played in my mind, rest didn't come easy anymore. But Sable had been my compass these past days, guiding me from revelation to revelation, like she'd memorized this path long ago and was simply waiting for me to follow. Now she stood at the door, head tilted, one paw raised expectantly. She was ready, so I followed. The morning air bit sharper than I'd expected. Autumn was surrendering to winter, and the sun hadn't yet crested the horizon. Sable moved with quiet certainty, leading us through sleeping streets, past the hospital's glowing windows, beyond the industrial park's chain-link fences, until we reached a narrow path winding into highland woods. Here, the world felt heavier, like the trees themselves were keeping secrets. We stopped at a fence I'd never noticed before, barbed wire coiled tight, a rusted private sign swinging in the breeze, the kind of barrier meant to keep out curious souls. Sable found where deer had trampled a passage and slipped through. I climbed after her. For nearly an hour we walked as the terrain grew wilder, the underbrush thickening with each step. Then we found it, a house. No lights, no signs of life, just a two-story structure nestled between two massive oaks, their branches cradling the roof like protective hands. Time had weathered the siding and sagged the porch, yet the place hummed with a strange energy, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Sable didn't hesitate. She climbed the creaking steps and sat by the door, her tail sweeping the worn boards. The knob turned easily. Inside, the air smelled of old pine and wood smoke. Dust motes danced in slanted light. Books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age. Furniture stood neatly arranged, barely used but lovingly kept. I took one careful step forward, Sable at my heels. Then the voice came. "You came." I turned slowly. In the back room, half hidden in shadow, sat a man in a wingback chair. Late 70s, perhaps older, thin but not frail. His eyes were sharp, watchful. "Who are you?" I asked. He stood. "My name is Emery Lennox." The name struck like lightning. Emery Lennox, banker, advisor, political donor. According to Darius and Miller's files, the last unidentified architect of the Quiet Circle. "You've been expecting me?" He nodded. "Not you, necessarily, but her." His gaze fell on Sable, and something like wonder softened his features. "I always thought she'd find this place eventually. She's guided others before, has a way of knowing." He paused. "She's not just a dog, you know." "No," he said, almost smiling. "She's what guilt can't kill and what innocence can't forget." The words settled between us, heavy with meaning I didn't fully grasp, but felt in my bones. "What do you want?" I asked. He moved to an antique cabinet and withdrew a small black case, placing it gently on the table between us. "I want to end it, all of it. The cover-ups, the lies, the files no one ever found." His hands, speckled with age, rested atop the case. "I know what I've done, what we all did, and I've had 30 years to prepare for this moment." I stayed silent as he opened the case. Inside lay 3 hard drives labeled by year, a thick folder bursting with banking records and land deeds, and, most curiously, a single tarnished key. "What's the key for?" "The vault beneath my office in the city. No one knows it's there. I kept it hidden even from the others." His voice grew quieter. "That vault holds the last of it. The names, the contracts, the bribe records. I couldn't destroy it. Told myself someone might need it someday." He met my eyes. Now they do. Why now? He looked past me out the window where dawn was just beginning to color the sky. Because I'm dying. And because the longer you live with a secret like this, his breath shuddered, the heavier it gets. I'm too tired to carry it anymore. Sable approached him with quiet grace, her paws whispering across the wooden floor. She settled at his feet like a gentle shadow. He looked down at her, his weathered face softening. "You remember, don't you?" he murmured, his voice as fragile as autumn leaves. "You were there that night, when we sealed the cabin, when we told the others it was over." Slowly he knelt before her, his knees cracking with age, and placed a trembling hand on her head. "I'm sorry," he breathed, the words heavy with decades of regret. "We took everything, the drives, the folder, the key, and left without another word. Emery didn't follow us as we turned to go. He remained in that chair, and something in the way, his shoulders slumped, told me he had no intention of ever rising again." The drive to Fairmont's Federal Building passed in a blur of golden morning light. Darius and Miller were already waiting, their faces tight with anticipation. I handed them the evidence piece by precious piece, like passing along fragments of a broken past. Miller opened the folder first, her fingers moving carefully through the pages, her expression shifting like clouds across the moon. Darius plugged in the hard drive, and what flashed across the screen made both of them sink into their chairs. "You've done it," Miller said softly, her voice thick with something like awe. "This is it. This is the end of the circle." I shook my head. "It's not me." My eyes found Sable, sitting sentry by the door, her ears pricked forward, her gaze steady as the North Star. "It's her." For the next 2 weeks, justice rolled through the county like a cleansing rain. Arrests swept up lawyers, judges, business owners, even a retired senator. The headlines shouted, "Quiet circle exposed. Decades-old conspiracy shattered. Truth buried beneath town. Unearthed by stray dog and whistleblower's son." Reporters camped outside my house, their cameras hungry for a story. I kept the curtains drawn. The only interview I gave was to a small local paper, and I made certain every word of credit went to Sable. She, of course, cared nothing for fame. Each morning before sunrise, she'd nudge me awake with her cold nose, insistent on walking her familiar route. No more hidden clues waited for us now, no more boxes to unearth, just the simple rhythm of the trail. It was as if she was teaching me how to live without constantly digging up the past. Then one crisp November morning near the lake, that same spot where I'd first seen her watching me from between the trees, she stopped suddenly. She sat, lifted her face to mine, and waited. I settled beside her on the damp grass. When she rested her head on my knee, something remarkable happened. For the first time in what felt like years, the weight I'd been carrying didn't crush me. I was simply grateful. Grateful she'd found me in the woods that day. Grateful I'd been wise enough to follow. Grateful for whatever mysterious force had woven our lives together. We stayed like that all morning, watching the mist dance across the lake's surface. Birds sketched patterns against the pale sky. A fisherman in a tiny boat cast his line, the ripples spreading like whispers. Life continued, ordinary and beautiful. The only difference now was the silence. It no longer hid terrible secrets. That night, I found her curled in her favorite spot by the fireplace, the flames painting gold highlights in her fur. Her eyes were closed, her breathing deep and even. I knelt beside her and stroked her back, feeling each steady rise and fall. "Rest. Now," I whispered, "you did it. You brought us all home." Her tail gave one contented thump against the rug. The next day, the wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of coming winter. But for the first time in my life, it felt like we'd finally closed a door